Okay, in this section, in this video, we're going to look at the different types of methods that we've covered thus far to solve quadratic equations. The first would be just doing the square root. So if you had a problem such as, here, we'll go over here, let's say 3x squared equals 27, you could just solve this by taking the square root. So this would be x squared equals divided by 3, you would get 9. So x would equal plus or minus 3 when you take the square root of both sides, because you're going to take the square root of this side and the square root of that side. So that would be the square root method. Obviously the factoring method would be when you're doing the parentheses and trying to find out your factors. The graphing method is what we talked about in the last video, where if you took the equation, you could plug it in your calculator and you could find your solutions from the graphs. There would be the x-intercepts, or if it's imaginary solutions, there are no real solutions that you can get off of the graph. Okay. Then you could do completing the square, which we spent a lot of time on. We did a couple days on completing the square. And then the one we just did in this section, the quadratic formula. The opposite of b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So the question is, how do you know which method to use and what to use when? Well, the discriminant can help you figure that out. So the discriminant, which is the b squared minus 4ac, remember that is it's the part that's actually under the square root. It's plus or minus. Remember, it's opposite of e, plus or minus the b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So the discriminant is the part that's underneath the square root. Okay, well, if that discriminant, the b squared minus 4ac, if that's a positive square number, and a positive square number would be examples of 1, 4, 9, 16, you'd be taking the square root of a perfect square. Well, that's going to come out to a very nice number. Anytime you don't have a square root in your final answer, or you don't have an imaginary number in your final answer, that thing's going to factor extremely nicely. So factoring would be the preferred method. Okay? Now, technically, you could use these other methods, quadratic formula, completing a square, graphing, but factoring should be the best option if you have a positive square number. Now, what happens if that discriminant is a positive non-square number, such as 2, or 3, or 5, or 6, or whatever, any of them that are not square numbers? Well, that means you're going to end up under their square root. You're going to have this. You're going to have plus or minus the square root of 2 as part of your answer, plus or minus the square root of 3. You're going to have a square root in your final answer. So if you want an exact solution, you're going to have to either use the quadratic formula or completing the square. Those are your only two options. Now, if you're willing to do approximate answers, you could throw graphing in there. And again, these could be converted into decimals as well. Quadratic formula, completing the square. But those would get graphing could usually, if it's not a nice number, which you would get through factoring, you're only going to get approximate answers through the graphing method. Okay. Now, what happens if your b squared minus 4ac is actually 0? Well, you'd be taking the square root of 0, which is 0, and 0 is a really nice number. And you're going to be adding and subtracting 0, which means this should factor nicely because 0 is a nice number. Okay, so factoring should be your preferred method there as well. And not only does it factor, because there's only one real solution, when you go to factor, these factors would have to be the same, such as maybe x plus 2, x plus 2, because remember that if that was equal to 0, x would equal negative 2. So you only have one solution, so both of these would have to be the same. So factoring not only is the easiest, it's super easy because both factors have to be the same. Now you could use quadratic formula, completing the square, graphing, but all of those would take much longer than factoring. Okay? Then if your b squared minus 4ac is negative, we'd be taking the square root of a negative number, I don't know, negative 4, Well, what's negative 4? That's 2i, so you're going to have I in your final answer. Technically, you'll have plus or minus in front of that, so you're going to have 2 imaginary answers. Well, if you're going to have imaginary solutions, again, the only way to get those are through the quadratic formula and completing this square. Okay, so we'll be using this chart here as we look at problems tomorrow when we analyze quadratics and try to pick up the best method.